We have a phenomenally experienced panel and indeed some very experienced people in the room as well to listen. So we're looking forward to the question and answer. And the running order is that Bob will start, followed by Jill, and we'll then have a break. And then Alisoun and Bridget will talk afterwards. It's roughly chronological, although I think everybody's going to stray over each other's areas. So I think if we're ready to go, Bob Hudson is known to many people, has been writing in this field for your whole career, really.
50 years.
So, we have 200 or 300 years of experience, but not in the room with everybody. Bob's currently a visiting professor at the Centre for Health Studies at the University of Kent, formerly at Durham, and also formerly a special advisor to the House of Commons Select Committee on Education. And as I've said, has got a whole career. He's going to talk to us about the development of services for older people, roughly from the war, about 1945, a bit before, up until, well, you'll say for yourself how far you're going to go. But the speakers have been invited to speak for around 20 minutes each. And we'll have a question and answer session before the refreshments, and then I hope to have a bigger discussion at the very end. Has anybody got any questions? Have I confused everybody, or anybody think they're in the wrong room? No? Right. So Bob, welcome, and thank you for battling with the trains coming down from Durham today. Over to you.
You, David. Right. Well, two things before I start. One, I retired when the first lockdown started, and I've not spoken a word in any public forum since then. So my voice probably won't carry. Apologies if it's rusty. Second, those of you who are looking at the streaming, we've just introduced ourselves to each other, and to my huge concern, most people here know a lot more than I do, but there you go. What can I say? 20 minutes to look at slightly pre-war, then how tales unfolded, policy tales, I should say. I'll do the policy bits up to about 1990. Others, I think, will focus more on practice, but obviously they interact very closely. Policies shape practice. I thought, rather than just do a turgid legislative shift, I would think of it in terms of three paradigms. And they roughly cover the last 70 years. I'm pressing this to go down. You'll have to do it for me, David. There's a...
Good.
Sorry, that might be my... Sorry.
You see, this is why I retired. I'm calling the first one the residual paradigm. It's the residual institutionalist paradigm. So that tells us two things. But it's an approach to what we now call social care, but we could have a very interesting talk about terminology. First of all, it indicates to us that this paradigm is about minimizing access to care, support and services. You all know the well-known principle, my goodness, it's not dead, of less eligibility. It also points us to the fact that the form of support that was available was to be institutional. So I'm not going to go over old ground because you know it. The 1834 Poor Law Act and what preceded it. The boards of guardians, who oddly were elected, democratic. Boards of guardians abolished in 1948, which was indeed seen as symbolically very important. It's the shift from the poor law to, well, to what? To a post-war welfare state, which appeared to be a brand new paradigm in lots of areas, in health, in housing, in education, in social security. But what about us? Not so different. As I say there, policies typically have long tails. You can't just shift overnight from paradigm A to paradigm B. Some things take an awful long time to move. Especially if, as was the case in our focus today, there was no comprehensive replacement policy. You think of all the stuff you read about Beveridge, the five giants: squalor, want, ignorance, disease, idleness. Where exactly does what we might call, I think I'll use Seabohm's term, the personal social services, where do they fit into that? The answer is not a lot. What we had after World War II, particularly as far as older people are concerned, is local authority welfare departments were created. A lot more going on with children, by the way, with the Curtis Report and the 1946 Children Act. The small local authority welfare departments, who in fact were only allowed to offer residential accommodation, and that to a very limited number of people. What we now call home care or daycare was ultra vires. They were not allowed to do it. Interesting. There's the institutional policy tale just carrying on, isn't it? Some interesting work by Peter Townsend, who was a doyen of studying old age, poverty and communities back in the 50s and 60s. He did some amazing tracking on how far the actual workhouses, the actual buildings were still being used after the 1948 Act. And he discovered, I put my specs on, by 1949, there were 40,000 residents in former workhouses. By 1960, the swinging 60s, it was still 35,000. That's a slow decline in this policy paradigm. And they were there long after that. I was a councillor in the 70s, and we still had the old workhouse, and it was used for, not for homeless families, but for homeless mothers and children, because the fathers weren't allowed in. Of course, there was some slow change, and that's towards the end there. There were modest permissions in the 60s to expand services beyond residential institutions. Not until 1962 that local authorities were empowered to provide a meal service directly. They could, of course, contract from the voluntary sector. 1968, a general power to promote the welfare of older people. And really an act, I don't know if you remember it, the 1970 Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, which came from a private member's bill by the MP Alf Morris, which people thought was very exciting at the time. But what we essentially had was 20 years of continuity and incrementalism. I'll keep going back to a sort of three-legged policy stool, three things that either are there or aren't there. One, a bureaucracy to plan, to make things happen. We didn't really have it. Two, professionals to listen, respond, and support. We didn't really have it. And funding to make things change. We didn't really have it. So we're now into the early to mid 60s, and we're still largely governed by a paradigm that began over a century earlier. I've called the next paradigm the state planning paradigm. I just made that up. It could be a different term. Some of you here will remember the 60s. It was swinging. It was cool. Things were changing. there was hope, there was inspiration. There was a new political and policy landscape. This was the era, oh, thank you. This was the era of planning, of expertise. We don't need experts now, do we? Of expertise. The idea that problems could be solved by consensus, by listening, thinking, gathering evidence. And a lot of that went on. Sorry. We had our version of that with the Seabohm Committee of 1965 and the subsequent report of 1968. Again, if I slip back to Peter Townsend, there was this big Fabian booklet came out at the time, and he referred to the recommendations of the Seabohm report as the fifth social service. He saw it as the last bit of the jigsaw in the post-war welfare state. We got health, we had housing, we had education, we had social security. It was our turn to be in the sunshine. The Seabohm report largely looked at structural change, but as part of that, it had a heavy emphasis upon professionalisation. So practice was also a big part of the Seabohm report. Some of you I know will remember well the days of Setsua. All of a sudden we had courses, professional courses for people, not just in field work, but in residential care settings, in daycare. On a personal note, at the time, I was actually on the first ever Social Services Committee in Sunderland. I was an elected councillor. And I couldn't begin to tell you the frisson of excitement we all felt. We thought something really important was happening. And we had, remember the three-leg policy still? We had bureaucratisation. We had big, powerful departments within local authorities. I could tell you about the battles between the different departments over who had what in between health and housing and education. We had professionalisation, the whole development of Setsua that I'd mentioned, and we had, I'll call it financialisation, just to have three isations at the end. Money was no object, believe me. Between 71 and 76, I mean, where I was in Sunderland, we got 20% increases a year. We had meetings once a year to decide what to do with this bounty. It didn't last long. It lasted about 7 years. And things began to change. Now, for one paradigm to be supplanted, a new one needs to be in the offing. Here it is. It's the neoliberal philosophy, which it's a complex thing in itself, but let's whittle it down with only 5 minutes left for me to say it's the idea that the welfare state is too large, it's unmanageable, and that the market can deliver more efficiency and more effective support. And if that's the ideology, the delivery mechanism is new public management. Well, all of the talk, I could say so much more about this, I'm skipping over a lot. The talk would be about consumer choice, quasi-markets. Robin wrote so much about quasi-markets. Competition between statutory and non-statutory providers. Just important to remember that as the old paradigm fell, only partly through lack of finance, it also fell because it was increasingly challenged by user groups, particularly the disability movement, carers movement, who said, this bureaucracy, it might seem more efficient, but we feel we're not listened to. There's no engagement. There's no real choice. One or two academics were using the term sebum factories to refer to the shift in the previous paradigm. There was also a big left-wing critique. You know, there was quite a lot of writers at the time bringing out left-wing texts. Barbara Wootton, a well-known sociologist, extremely critical of the old client professional caseworker model, saying the real problem here is structural, not individual. You even had a magazine that came out once a month called Case Con. Some of you will remember that, and the title tells you what they think, that casework is a con. So you had this attack on professionalization, you had an attack on bureaucracies, you had an attack on finance. This was 76, the IMF, Dennis Healy was the Chancellor. All these are things that Margaret Thatcher was very happy to hear about. She didn't like professionalization, conspiracies against people who need support. She didn't like bureaucracies. Markets were much better than bureaucracies. She didn't like money. I said there, probably the personal social services they are the canary down the ideological mine of neoliberalism. You couldn't really do, for example, today, we did with the personal social services. I wish I had time to go the interest somehow having financial streams that were only available to support non-salary providers. There is still discussion. There was conspiracy because it all started with a very obscure change to supplementary benefit regulations by a long-forgotten eccentric minister called Rhodes Boyson. But simply by pulling some financial levers and saying resources will only go to those sectors and not to that sector, over a period of time, it becomes the new paradigm. I'm going to leave to Alisoun, because I know she has more to say about Griffiths, the White Paper Caring for People, and the subsequent 1990 Act. Two things to end. We've gone from, I'll just slip back to it for a second. We've gone from that, when we in social services, we the councillors and the officers, of course, we decided what was provided. We planned for it. To the point today where there are 5,500 different care home providers and 10,000 different home care providers, and 95% of provision is in the non-statutory sector. Now, there's a paradigm shift for you. And if you think, I just want to end thinking about paradigm shifts. Think of the first one, the residual institutionalist. It lasted about 120 years before it was finally supplanted. It took 20 years to get rid of it, from say 1948 to 68, mid-70s, 25 years to get rid of it. placebo changes, because they had so little time to bed in, were easily overturned. They had a decade, and then the new paradigm began to make inroads. We've now had 35 years of the market paradigm. So one of Labour's leading politicians interviewed the other week. What's your plan on social care? He was asked. And his answer was, well, we're not going to nationalise them, are we? And of course you're not. How do you undo 30, 40 years of the market paradigm? Very hard. And I mean, we might come onto it, but the issue now is, how do we get the sort of practice, policy and support we want? Can we do it within this paradigm, or is it a lost cause for the things we used to do in our youth? That's my time up, so I think I better stop there. Thanks for listening. I've had a great time.
We did now.
Ah, you did. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the three paradigms. That certainly resonated, and many of us in our experience have lived through that and have the scars to remember it. I've been asked to say to colleagues at home, would you please switch off your cameras as well as remaining mute? The sound quality for the translators is not apparently very good. Colleagues may not have heard at the beginning, we have some BSL translators who are working online. So if you could turn off your cameras, that will reduce the bandwidth or increase it, one or the other. And that's been requested. But Bob, thank you. That in such a short time to cover such a span and to stir up emotions and feelings and reflections as you were going, I could feel it in the room. We're now going to go on to Jill, who's going to take a very different approach, starting from an article that Jill will mention, I think possibly a book by a practitioner in the 1950s, I think, and Jill will explain that. So we're starting from practice, but looking at what practice was involved at the time. Jill, as you will know, has been the head of the unit here, is now Professor Emerita of Social Work at King's College London, recently retired as the Director of the Policy Research Unit in Health and Social Care Workforce Planning here, is a trustee of the Centre for Policy on Ageing. And Jill, you've had a long interest in this area. So thank you for bringing this, starting from this micro point, but looking at histories of dementia and the invisibility of dementia as an issue. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to shout to all the people in this room, but for the benefit of people being at home, also for people who might be having an after dinner snooze. I'm going to be talking about older people living with dementia, partly because of my own interest in what used to be called dementia, and indeed my own interest in social work with older people. When I first started teaching on a social work programme, largely because I think I was the only one available, I did the lecture for the whole 2 or 3 year course on older people, which was optional. So there is very rarely a rose-coloured view, I think, of older people in social work education. And one of the things I was interested in doing is exploring some of the history of this from a practice point of view. And we are, I'll just try and get the slide to move on. Sorry about that. There. Yeah. So I'll start here with the slide, 10 brownie points for people who can remember which is the social worker and which is the doctor in probably the best known film of this era, in which a person encountered another person at what was a fictitious railway station, which of course is Carnforth. if anybody wants to go there. The buffet is still there. There's a museum to the brief encounters that happened at Carnforth railway station. This is a picture with Celia Johnson featuring as the social worker in the 1940s. There is another version in which the social worker is quaintly portrayed by Sophia Loren, which might have been a more interesting film in many respects, with Richard Burton as your favourite GP. So perhaps this is the image of social work in the 1940s. She was clearly engaged in many other activities and probably worked in children's services. Mentions of dementia, working with older people were not there. And so if we look for dementia, we have to take a number of descriptions of it that relate to the time in which it took place. So as you can see here, it could be senility, it could be elderly mentally ill, elderly mentally infirm, ESME and ESME services, depending on where you live, they were given these acronyms, and sometimes they were just not there, and it was people were infirm, people were incurable. And the word dementia doesn't come on until I think really when people like Bridget Penhale and colleagues were writing about it not too long ago. Forgotten People is a good title for this book about social work with dementia, with people living with dementia at that time. So looking for dementia, what do we need to do? We need to look at, I suppose, the emergence of the senile patient, just to give it the term, because people living with senility were often, if not at home, living in hospitals. But what happens, of course, is that hospitals begin to think that cure is what they should be doing rather than care. And so a very nice doctoral thesis about Hanwell Asylum, Hanwell being in sort of Ealing area nowadays, talks about the senile patient being defined by the criteria which legitimated their exclusion from the asylum. They were physically feeble, essentially manageable, and inherently and irreversibly aged. Over this period, insanity in old age became, to far greater extent than before, the insanity of old age. So these, I think, are very useful things to do, but we're reliant very much on people who do doctoral theses for the detail of social work practice in here. And I think in many ways, doctoral theses are largely unexplored in social work histories. We talk about histories of histories or synopses of so on, but there are a number of ones, particularly coming from health services, but also from a number of other places, anthropology, philosophy, and so on, which need mining in future years. The thesis is available, as they all are now, and here's an illustration of a case record of a lady called Jemima Burns, age 77. You can't really read it, of course, but it's just to say how fantastically good at record keeping people were in those days, and how we are going to suffer probably nowadays because it's all on somebody's laptop that's totally disappeared and unusable, and there will be no records to look at ever again. So what were British social workers doing in wartime? And this is a contemporary account by an American who came over and asked that question. He did, of course, say, as we probably all know, that there was much greater focus on the social work role with children, particularly during in respect of the evacuees. There was also much social work with refugees, displaced people, adoption and fostering, particularly of children who might be of then called mixed race, was a social work activity with the American GIs and so on. And children's homes were established, sometimes for refugees, sometimes just for orphans, not just for, but sometimes for orphans or displaced children. Little mention, of course, of ageing, other than our favourite, for some of us, looking at shared lives and the history of boarding out services or adult fostering, a little bit of emergence that one of the things you can do with older people is stop them bed blocking hospitals that would be needed for somebody else. Outside, there was welfare work, but it was largely confined to people, to large factories, employers, and so on. So there was a social work role in those, which has largely been forgotten. And casework had various imperatives, but they were, of course, hard to meet. And our American colleague, Stuart Jaffery, says, in 1942, two major needs in British social work, so very much combined with what Bob was talking about, the strengthening of the work of social work machinery with close coordination, and the strengthening of the profession. I apologise if this quote is not working well, but it's really saying, as Bob talked about, that the profession was not strong, very diffuse, and people would often call themselves social workers who might be volunteers or welfare workers more generally. However, as our colleague Robin Means and his co-author Randall Smith have been able to mine from various records, there was an impact of the Second World War in relation to older people's care. It was about the undermining of those in institutional care. So whether you were evacuated or you moved out of hostels and so on, that was a movement then. The increasing needs of many frail elderly, another term used then, probably coming back into social work discourse a lot nowadays, as the health service uses frailty to a much greater extent than social work has done for many decades. Through women working, general dislocation, far less domestic service. And I think we often forget how important the role of servants were, and domestic servants in the care of older people, with or without dementia. So the development gradually of something like home help services. And then a reformulation perhaps of attitudes among officials, perhaps in local councils, but certainly within the ministries, towards residential provision for older people, to have a sunshine hotel. I love a sunshine hotel. I'd like to see it, but I'm afraid it's a bit more faulty towers quite often. To uphold civilian morale, and must remember that many women working in the munitions factories, worried about their mums, would have to have reassurance that mum or grandma was going to be looked after okay. So I commend to people an article written by Robin and his colleague in Ageing in Society. Do turn back to it. I'm sure it's open access, isn't it, Robin? For anybody. And but however, we often think about Richard Titmuss as saying a great deal of truth unto power. Here's a quote from him, which unfortunately talks about the dampening of enthusiasm of newly enrolled voluntary nurses who'd expected to nurse soldiers, and there in the Second World War, unfortunately, had to nurse, or perhaps refused to nurse, incontinent and senile old people. So perhaps then still some of the stigma about working in residential care, and particularly working with people with who had dementia or senility. We have mental health hospitals or asylums moving, as Bob said. They too managed to survive the changes of the NHS and the National Assistance Act. But by the 1950s, 2/3 of patients were there voluntarily, not under compulsory orders. And as people became more willing to be admitted to a mental hospital, increasing numbers led to overcrowding. So services were far from comprehensive and were still poor and non-existent for the elderly who were mentally infirm. So the asylums, as we think of being quite important in the history of development of community care, by the 1950s, there were, as many people will know, very few older people occupying them. And those that did were often in places called backwards, or literally as well as metaphorically, the backwards of such provision. Here is a report from the Nuffield Trust talking about the NHS history and how rare it is, I suppose, to think about the social care or social work histories, to have that authoritative view that the Nuffield and others contributed to during that time. Well, money matters, of course, doesn't it, as Bob has said, and the 1950s, an era of partial austerity for the NHS, was raised again the question of what we would call bed blocking. So a bed blocking standoff was enacted, and going locally to think about things is probably sometimes more reveals a lot more than nationally. So here are some papers from the North East Somerset Hospital Management Committee that not me, but another author in Ageing in Society managed to pull out, particularly taking an economic analysis of what was going on, and talked about how difficult the Hospital Management Committee, we'd now call it a trust board or something like that, was facing the problems of bed blocking, as they might call it, and talking about separate accommodation for residents with senile dementia. So again, always part of the problem for the NHS, but rarely picked up by local authorities, who of course saw this as a clinical or a medical condition in many respects. The Hospital Management Committee here pleaded with the ministry for more resources for domiciliary care. So this was a pretty integrated service, wasn't it? But to no avail, particularly in Somerset. And here's a nice picture from the said trust nowadays. So where do we end up with? We end up with very few descriptions of any social work practice with people living with dementia. As David said, one of the few examples I found was an account in a small pamphlet issued by Miss Muriel Bree, who's sometimes called Muriel, sometimes Molly, who spoke about her very detailed practice experience with people living with dementia, but in this case, they were younger people and they had had syphilis. So this was one of the major concerns, of course, for the society, for the NHS, for public health generally, but people were treated as far as they could at that time within a clinical setting. Here she talks about her praxis in Epsom and something called the Mott Clinic. This problem has largely gone. We don't have social workers doing this sort of job, but she describes it in great detail, and particular account she takes of the home visits that she makes to those people discharged from the Mott Clinic. So they leave the hospital and they go home because they are incurable. And again, their features of dementia are something in which she recognises very clearly the pressure on their families of having this person sent home incurable with rising what we would call health and care needs. So she looks at 275 case records, largely a younger group, very many of them poor, 7 illustrated case studies, and this growing loss of cognitive ability. And that's why they're called dement. She calls it the dement in the community. So she does aftercare. She goes around, tries to support the families, recognises the tremendous role that they're undertaking of caring for their relatives who they thought perhaps might be treated in hospital as far as possible, but essentially then they're sent out as incurable. And Miss Bree describes 2/3 of these patients as being, sorry about that, just lost the slide there, as leaving the Mott Clinic as being permanently disabled, characterised by being childish, suggestible, without insight into his own condition, and it isn't just necessary, it wasn't only men, subject to temper tantrums and sometimes incontinent. So refers then to the huge amount of work that the families, many of whom had young children, because it's largely a younger population, were carrying in those days. And that is social work in the 1950s. So moving on, slightly straying now into the 1960s, we come to a very seminal text, which when I was teaching, people used to refer to a lot. And I knew they hadn't read it because there was no copy of Sans Everything in our local library or anything like that. I pinched a copy from somebody a long while ago and have still hung on to it. It's called Sans Everything, and in many ways it's Sans social work. It was early, very much of one of the first in the era of scandals around long stay hospital care, limited social work involvement, as I'll say later. And if you're looking for social work, strangely enough, it does feature in quite a number of the recommendations around this era about the findings of inquiries. And it was also subtitled Diary of a Nobody. She isn't a nobody. The fact is she knew somebody who was a somebody. And the woman she knew was Barbara Robb. But the story is that of Miss Amy Gibbs, a retired seamstress in her mid-70s who was admitted to Free and Barnet Psychiatric Hospital, and she was ordered, she got worse, so they said, and she was transferred to a long stay ward for confused elderly people, and there could have been a senile dementia ward, then classified as psychogeriatric. In anticipation of her remaining there, her furniture and her household possessions was sold up. And this is a report from another PhD thesis done by David Cochrane, published in the 1990, where he did go out and interview a number of people who knew Barbara Robb, went through the entire archives, and they're all at the LSE. David describes some of the work he had to do. Barbara's husband left all the archives, and she collected everything. Every piece of paper, every scrap is there in, I think, 120 A4 ring binders. So part of a PhD, if anybody's interested in doing one, could be that you classify these documents. So there is always opportunity to do that. She had begun to classify them. She was very, very, very astute woman, but she didn't get that far. So her source, this is the title of David's PhD, and she started a campaign to improve standards of care in mental hospitals, a case study of the process of social policy change. And what a change that person made. She was not a social worker, alas. However, there are 2 mentions of social work in here, and we have an extract from another author who's really focused on Sans Everything, a psychiatrist called Claire Hilton, whose book is very, very readable, and because it was funded by the Wellcome Trust, is open access. So it's a great study. And she notes that there are pseudonymized people there, a Miss Cloak being the social worker who contributed to her discussions of what was going on at Friern Hospital. You will also see that there's a large cast of journalists and editors who then, at that time, were very interested in there. You'll even see the News of the World on there, great at that time, an interest in social policy scandals. However, what we happen is some reflection by Barbara and other people about one of the problems with hospitals such as Friern is that they had very little social work engagement. It would be interesting to track through their thinking about why social work would have made that difference. And indeed, I suppose in relation to scandals nowadays, what were the roles of social workers in Mid Staffordshire, for example, or Wharton Hall, or any of the other scandals that have happened. But here she said that compared to similar hospitals, actually this is Claire Hilton, compared to similar hospitals, Friern had lacked social workers to assist with arranging discharge. It had 1 qualified and 2 unqualified social workers with high rates of staff turnover. So plus ça change there. And the Ministry of Health had done that, creating an impossible workload. So we think that turnover is a bit of a problem nowadays. It was so in 1960s too. Friern social workers did provide some witness statements. Others were very largely from nurses and other staff. And Claire Hilton has pulled those out. So social workers, she says, was to some degree outside the rigid hospital hierarchy, which again is a feature that picks up in a lot of social work literature. So somewhat protected from the victimization experienced by the nurses. And she found 2 social workers, one a trainee and one a social worker who was involved, but also had a family member in a hospital. And you can see from their quotes that they were Roger Moody says the hospital was trying to banish them completely from the mind. Dorothy talks about lack of visitors, lack of bedtime routines, etc. In the same way as Barbara Robb had commented on in the case of Amy Gibbs. So examples of the Department of Health and Social Security recommendations spanned mental illness and mental health hospitals and set out some interim standards, which are probably among the most boring of documents you would ever want to read. Interim, they might not happen, and who was going to mind too much anyway. But social work does feature in there. It remains there, as social work can be a solution to some of those problems. And so you can see, I'm sure you're all familiar with DHS circular HM 68, etc. But also, I think, looking again about how health and welfare and the development of community care, that white paper then begins to see social work as one of the example, perhaps some of the solution to problems, not necessarily with the great evidence base of this is what can happen in good practice. So, continued themes. What do we get? The term elderly mentally infirm is undefined and extraordinarily plastic. So say Alistair MacDonald and Tom Denning in 2002. So these terms still apply, and probably if you go somewhere, I will still see EMI homes referred to. Will anybody else see that? People in the room are nodding there, or ESME, and we'll tell you it's an ESME service. And if you're a new trainee, you might look puzzled at that, but that's what they're meaning: elderly severely mentally ill or elderly severely mentally infirm. Those terms last, don't they, for generations. Like Bob says, a tail keeps wagging the policy tail keeps the dog alive. So elderly mentally infirm is undefined, plastic, and enduring. It's sometimes limited to people with dementia, but can be for people with other conditions as well. So homes are more highly staffed and get better fees, but they're rare and often full. EMI infirm patients wait in hospital beds longer. Social workers tend to imply that EMI means additionally having behavioural problems. So not still a great history of social work being able to offer some hope, or indeed some optimism about it. People with quiet dementia, and I think that's a very important point, are often excluded from specialist care. And Mary Marshall, referring to the past, talks about it as unusual for her. So Mary Marshall, being perhaps one of the key writers and developers as a social worker in practice with people living with dementia, founder of the University of Stirling's first Dementia Development Centre, and so on, talking of 1967, for her, the prospect of working with older people appealed. It certainly didn't in many qualified social workers. They were often told you could work with older people, in my experience, if you were finding child protection a bit difficult. So not a history to be too proud of. But for people like Mary, there was the richness of older people's history, the importance of relationships and the complexity of all this, all the things that Bob was talking about, housing, social services and health, and you might well ask, and benefits as well in that respect. And she liked older people. It was a neglected area, and she's talking the 1960s, so things hadn't changed much from the 1940s. There were fewer standard procedures than in children's services, and primary care and work with older people was very much an untenanted area. Perhaps we might discuss whether or not that's the same today. So just a note on data sources. Miss Bree's account of her career, her personal life and so on is in a series of interviews undertaken by Cohen, and they're called the Cohen interviews, edited by Tim Cook and Harry Marsh. Commend those to you. They're online in the Modern Record Centre. And here for a bit of history is when we discussed the Cohen interviews in the Social Work History Network nearly a decade ago. I still had my jacket. I'm not sure if anybody else has their same clothes, but we had the great pleasure of having some of the people who were involved in transcribing, some of the people who'd worked on the Cohen interviews. And what a rich source of data that is, a set of interviews with 40 social workers who described what they did, largely LSE trained and obviously alive and able to contribute their thoughts, but how much we lack that today for contemporary social workers or for those who've recently retired. For the 21st centuries, what's needed? I think there needs to be more personal accounts. I came across this one by Nick Harvey in Social Work and Social Services Review, who just discusses what it was like working as a social worker in mental health services around about the London area. Maybe people working in Greenwich knew him. He talks about this, and he sort of rises to become a manager, and and he does this and he does that. You know, just a great. This is what it was like being a social services practitioner, social work practitioner. And then, of course, for us, for professionals, keeping in mind that there are other histories to be told, and particularly those by people with dementia about how they're gone. And in Scotland, they've really majored on this. And Innovations in Dementia is one of the groups that's been able to assemble together a great history, but also something that will stand the test of time by providing a legacy for us about what people living with dementia might want. So I'm going to stop there and hopefully have inspired people to look at theses, but also to create some of the history that might be around, because as the new demographics say, nowadays about half the people in this room and probably half the people online are going to get dementia, and a very large number of us will be lucky if we live to be that long. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill, for bringing the practice perspective alongside the policy. Policy sometimes shapes practice, but practice also drives policy sometimes. It works in both directions. We have a few minutes for comments. I guess one of the things that is striking, just to kick off, is how many of one's friends and one's own family are caught up with these issues, and yet it doesn't get the sort of attention that it really needs. I could say from my own family in the last 2 or 3 years, there are issues. I had a phone call this week from somebody, found my name on the Baswell list of consultants. I'm struggling with finding arrangements for my father. Who do I speak to? Who can I get advice from? And there were various suggestions, but it's affecting so many people, and yet it doesn't get the attention it needs, I think. Anybody want to chip in? Can we put people up on the screen? We're challenged, but anybody want to make a comment or a reflection? Feel free from a position of personal experience, or Robin, you were mentioned.
I'll try and beat Jill's social work one, because in my social work course, which was the Warwick social work course, driven by Peter Leonard and Paul Corrigan, where we were required to integrate Freud and Marx in 8 lectures, you were certainly up as a qualified social worker, but we voted on other things. And one of the things we voted on was social work with older people. So we didn't even get the lecture because we didn't get enough votes for it to appear. But interestingly, having said that, the enthusiasm that Warwick did generate meant that the four of us who voted and lost the vote created a course that we carried out in the evening. So we self-created a course on social work with older people, interestingly. But my advice wouldn't be to run 8 lectures on Freud and Marx in order to encourage practice in social work.
In this day and age, you never know whether mentioning a name might bring the police to your door. But anyway, Bridget.
I suppose I'd just like to throw into the mix of quite an early journal paper, which was a study. For the life of me, I can't remember who wrote it, of course not, but it was a study of social work student preferences for where they were going to work once they qualified. And it has a delightful title, which is first, childcare, second, mental health, third, the elderly. And I'm just wondering how much that has changed or not.
Prompts me to think, I hadn't thought of this before, but actually my first article that I ever wrote was around sheltered housing for older people. And it was based on a study that the Social Services Department in Nottingham wanted to do because they were struggling with their sheltered housing. And David Wilcox was involved with that. And I remember I came very proud with a finding and I presented the finding. I won't go into it now, there isn't time. And everybody said, well, that's obvious. And David Wilcox, who was then the professor, said, well, you'll find with research, either it is obvious and therefore why did you bother, or we don't believe it, so why did you bother? That's the traditional penalty for researchers. Anybody else want to come in?
Hand up from Lynn.
Lynn, welcome. Good to see you on the screen, and you need to unmute. And thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. Very interesting. I just wanted to say, in terms of the future, we do have a National Institute for Health and Care Research program that Jerry Nikowski is involved in on social work with older people. So hopefully this will raise the profile of what's possible and where we do need to have some fantastic social workers working with and alongside older people and their carers. So perhaps hope for the future.
Indeed, it's important. I see June has got her hand up, and I'll go in the order that is there. I'll go to Jackie Moore first and then to June. And we have time for more conversation at the end, but quickly for now, Jackie.
Yes, I was just going to really remember that when I had a placement very early on in about 65 in a general hospital, people had to be able to walk a corridor to become the responsibility of the local authority. And later on, when I was practicing in a charity in the 80s, the whole boundary between what is considered health and what is considered personal social services or local authority responsibilities has shifted completely, so that a lot of work with older people is now seen as the responsibility of local authorities. I mean, my father had dementia, and it wasn't really even seen particularly as a social, as a health responsibility. We had to pay very substantial fees for him to be looked after. And the only reason we had any social services involvement was because at one point he was violent and had been sectioned. So I'm just saying, I think behind all of this, there's been a complete shift of responsibility without any money, except private money, really.
Comes back to Bob's point about money and start at his three-legged stool. Thanks, Jackie. June?
Yeah, just a comment on the social worker preferences. Nobody really mentioned patch, or if they did, I missed it. But actually, patch, the quite short appearance of patch made a very big difference, I think, to people learning. At me, for instance, as a through and through childcare officer, worked in a patch in rural Norfolk. And therefore, much of my caseload was actually working with elderly people, which I greatly valued, learned a huge amount. And I subsequently then went to teach at UEA. And I think probably my teaching was much more cognizant of across age groups than it would have been if I hadn't been a patch social worker.
Yeah. Anybody else? Just remembering another historical reference, I was a governor of the National Institute for Social Work in the 1980s, and we had regular seminars there, and Enid Levin and colleagues at the National Institute. I remember a really powerful seminar for governors and others of some of their findings. At the time, there was a criticism that social workers were doing friendly visiting. Is that the right phrase? That they were just dropping in to see people, and really was that worthwhile? And they did research, what were social workers actually doing? And they found out that by and large, most of the time, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the time, social workers were dealing with a complex interaction of a number of factors: money, housing, health, and relationships, probably mental health as well. I always think I've forgotten one. And that powerful research finding then did shape some of the thinking about policy, that social workers were dealing with issues that no other professionals were willing or able to engage with, because of that connection of the interface between those hugely important and very complex systems. Which I did a lot of for this seminar. I'd hoped to get some people from National Institute to talk about that, but we weren't able to do it in the end. So if somebody's listening, apologies, but it needs to be remembered.
What did you say that was called? That study or article?
I think that the name of the research was Enid Levin. I guess that you could find it at the Warwick University archives.
Maybe Stephen can remember, or has got a copy of it. Stephen was at Niswa.
Freelance.
Joe Moriarty was there as well. Joe has got some. I did talk with Joe about this. Well, I think we've got the time for a break. Was there a question? Sorry, Greg, I beg your pardon. You've got your hands up, Greg.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on what June was mentioning about PAP system, and Jill in her very helpful summary there. I just wanted to pose the question about how important was the settlement movement in supporting the development of social work and social work practice with older people. I ask because when I did my social work training quite a long time ago now, I did actually do a placement in Bristol settlement, and I was struck there because I was also doing a placement in social services, that the work that the settlement was doing even in those days, this was mid-80s, was completely different to what was being done in a local authority social service department.
Anybody want to comment on settlements? Sarah, yeah, your recent book.
Sorry, I'm doing 101 things because I'm trying to do some reflections on what's been talked about.
Anything on the settlement movement and working in this field?
Greg is making is that, in essence, institutions like that, you undertake what's known as real social work, as opposed to doing kind of the bureaucratic interventions that you do in other, well, certainly contemporary social work today. But I don't think. Sorry.
Speak up a bit. Yeah, sorry. Sarah, if you talk to the.
So just saying that
could everybody's going to mute online? If you could go on mute. Let's see. No, it's still not on mute.
social work in settings that you perhaps may not do in what are now local authority social work teams, which is the point that June was making as well, isn't it? That in essence it opens you up to doing kind of that face-to-face relationship built and based work.
Yeah. That was one of the other key things from the NISWA research. As a social worker, you'd say this, wouldn't you? Relationships count, and care management was never intended to be a mechanistic process. If you go back, we go back to talk to the people who set it all up. It was never intended, but I stray into your territory, so we'll come back to that later. I think that's probably where we should take a break for about 10 minutes. For people here in London, there's tea and coffee and refreshments I'll help with. However, could I just say one thing before we break? The History Network has always run on donations from those who come. And everybody chipped in 10 quid and we've got an amount. Now we have so many online and the webinars have got smaller. We haven't been collecting so much, and our ability to pay for our speakers to come depends on having some resource capacity. So I am asking those who are willing and able, we didn't give an advance notice, to contribute what you're able. £10 would be fantastic, but £5 or even one would count, and it would help top up our balance, which at the moment is around £600, I think 600 or 700 after this meeting, which doesn't give us a really confident basis for inviting other speakers to future webinars. But apart from that, afterwards I'll tell you about the programme for next year, but now let's break for teas and coffees for about 10 minutes or so. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks to colleagues, the speakers are helping to pour. Pleased to say that we have an agreement with professional social work that we will have an article based on each of our seminars in future that will be carried. The first one, which Brian Parrott has written on on community, will be in the issue that is coming out in the next few days. That has taken since March to get together, but it's coming out in the November issue of Professional Social Work. Sarah has kindly agreed to write an overview of this webinar. It's not a he said, she said, but it's supposed to be a reflection of the themes that came out and a discussion that are appropriate for a professional journal, a one-page article usually. And we hope that will be the pattern for the future. And just to say, for the future, we have got a number of things in the pipeline for next year. The first one, probably in early February, will be based around Mark Henriksen's new book on the history of social work. Mark Henriksen's professor at Auckland University in New Zealand. It's a really interesting book, which I reviewed for one of the professional journals. I think it was International Social Work rather than BJSW. But he starts back in Constantine in the 4th century and then reflects on the values and ethics that have evolved in the context of decolonialisation and growing diversity of social work. So there's a lot in there to look at. Another new book which has come out, edited by Vasilios Ikomadis, who's now in Athens, was at Essex, still is a bit at Essex. With a colleague, he's looked at social work's complicity with authoritarian regimes. And it's a painful part of social work history, maybe particularly relevant in the current context. But we're thinking possibly, I'd quite like to do that with our American colleagues, because we have a link with the social welfare history group in the States. and that will be later in the year, but we hope that both of those will be webinars. And we are also looking at something in the childcare area around possibly neglect or adoption. But there are some ideas that Karen Lyons and June Coburn are working on, and that will be probably in the spring. So Mark Hedrickson in February, something around children's services in April, May, and we hope something else around there. And then June and Jill and I were talking about 25th anniversary of Griffiths, and should we be having something about that later in the year? So we've got some links. So having said that, I won't need to say that at the end. And now we're going to move straight on to two more interesting themes moving forward. Alisoun is emeritus professor or professor emerita. We've had a debate about this of social gerontology and social work at the University of Kent. Been over 25 years at Kent and has worked as a social worker and team manager, and still researching innovative social work with older people, and enthused and passionate about it. So off you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I want to start by apologising for the busyness of my slides and for the fact that they're not particularly snatched up. I've been ill. The content's cool, I think, but had I had a bit more time, I would have made them a little bit more interesting. But people are very welcome to them, by the way. If anyone's interested, welcome to. Okay, I'm going to be talking about these issues, starting off with thinking about care management. Where did it come from? So actually, I started life as an academic in the personal social services research unit, project in community care for elderly people. And in fact, it was at PSSLU where the original work was done, called the Kent Community Care Project, in a part of Kent called Thanet, where there was a large population of older people. And it was done in the mid-1980s, and it was Ben Davis, David Chalice, Martin Knapp, and others. And they really tested out, was it possible, if you gave frontline social workers mainly money, and you got them to work with older people, was it possible to do things differently, to avoid admissions to care homes? And the short answer was yes, it was, and to improve outcomes to the benefit of their family and themselves. It was rolled out then to at least 2 or 3 other local authorities, including somebody mentioned Lewisham, subsequently to Lewisham mental health teams later on. And again, those findings were replicated. It was always very carefully worded, though, that high quality case management services targeted correctly achieved improvements to well-being and cost less and reduced carer stress. It was very timely work. It fitted with the zeitgeist of policy at the time. And the work was widely cited in the 1989 Care People White Paper, which you've already heard about, in Griffiths' work, and was viewed by policymakers at the time as the panacea. Well, you know, we all know what that means, don't we? It's never going to work if it's seen as a panacea, but ultimately quite complex problems. But, and this is really Chalice's words, the national rollout was done without being faithful to the model and the evidence. Different local authorities did different things, and very few of them actually acted on devolving budgets to frontline staff. So I think it's fair to say that the origins were relatively laudable. It was about trying to help practitioners work with older people in some circumstances to think through alternatives to long-term care. They also made the point that organisations have to be willing to take the risk to trust their staff to actually basically use public money in an efficient way. Anyway, it was grasped with both hands, welcomed as an innovative model of care under the umbrella of the NHS and Community Care Act. But let's remember when this was happening. It's quite important. We've already heard from Bob and from Jill just about the wider context. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It was introduced community care at a time of national global downturn in the economy, very much the growth of the neoliberal market. That was being embraced with both hands, particularly in welfare area, and I think it was you, Bob, that said nowhere has it penetrated more deeply in social care. So it was very much embraced with both hands at that time. And of course, there was, public services were being very widely criticised for being monolithic, for being fragmented, for not being responsive, and for not really deinstitutionalising as quickly and effectively and as meaningfully as the calls were asked. And there was, behind all that was another rhetoric, some narratives around the burden of the older population. We have to tackle it, we have to do things flexibly and quickly, and this is a burden for the welfare state. And also an emphasis which hasn't gone away, hence what's still with us, I'll come back to that later. The importance of family care, very much the rhetoric, the family is the right place for care of people with dependent needs. Meanwhile, the policy rubric was talking about rights, empowerment, choice, and a seismic shift really occurred to the welfare state at the time, which kind of went quietly. It happened quietly. There wasn't the fanfare that you might have expected, but it happened nevertheless, away from publicly funded care and support. And this, in the words of Mo Ray, set the scene for the allocation of personal social services resources to move from a consensual position of shared social risk and collective responsibility for need towards the control and distribution of finite resources and the adoption of an administrative model of welfare. I'm not going to talk about the self-directed care. Bob, I think, mentioned that. There was, in a parallel universe, a call, particularly from younger disabled people, for agreeing really with the criticisms of the monolithic state, saying we would like to have our own money to make our own decisions. So that was happening in a parallel universe. So what happened about social work? Well, really, social workers were rebranded overnight practically as care managers, and their role changed to that of being the operational arm of community care, to arranging care packages via an assessment, and being brokers, words like brokerage, what started to be used in social work circles. The Labour government continued really with the trend. I mean, it used slightly softer language like modernising services, but the language of efficiency, of scarce resources, of targeting, of focusing, of rationing, this all entered the public parlance, including the social work parlance. And processes like assessments really became focused much more on what people could not do. You shrink down the welfare state, you narrow the doors. Inevitably, perhaps, language shifts to deficiency, to deficits, to dependency, to what people cannot manage. And eligibility support was increasingly about who's let into the system and what do they need support with. And assessment, of course, became increasingly about rationing. And harm and risk and the language of risk became also part of the public parlance. And I love this quote by Lloyd. I mean, she talks about sort of sleight of policy hand, that the language of policies is always very positive, abstract, of course, but very rights, choice, and all of that. Meanwhile, down in the real world of local authority, social work and social care, it's the management of resources that takes primacy. And somehow those two parallel universes, don't actually meet. The other thing about care management was that, of course, it stopped being about social workers being care managers. Actually, at the time in the early 1990s, mid 1990s, quite a lot of care managers were nurses or occupational therapists, and there was also a eroding of the role of professionals, and other social care workers started to do some of the roles that had previously been done by social workers. And by the way, when I say I am not in any way having a pop at unqualified workers who do fantastic work, but it was nevertheless an erosion of some of the roles that professionals previously done. Actually, Griffiths doesn't mention social work once, not one mention of it in his reports and work. And so social work was further eroded by neoliberal policies, but it never had a particularly strong platform in the first place. I think it's fair to say, Robin, Bob, and others in this room, and Jill, you'll know this, and Bridget, but it was always fairly fragile. It never had a strong identity in the social work firmament. But it was definitely clipped further. Its wings were clipped further by neoliberal policy. And as Limbury says, it became suffocated by the straitjacket of care management and perhaps offered even less occupational potential than previously. And of course, what started to happen was the rational technical priorities, people like Ingram and Ferguson talk about it, policies, procedure, tick boxes, guidelines, criteria, these dominated, not relationships and not the expertise that social workers had in the law, in relationship skills, knowledge about services, knowledge about complexity, understanding of older people's needs. So those sorts of softer skills were being eroded and marginalised. And I'm actually not sure when this happened. I'm not sure when the personal social services stopped being talked about and adult social care started being talked about. I think, perhaps other people have views on this. But certainly, social work became eclipsed over time by this wider umbrella of adult social care. And as I said earlier, more traditional social work roles began to be done by non-qualified social care staff. Social work sort of reserved for just the very complex and safeguarding issues. And the term safeguarding started to be used. Actually, again, Bridget, I'm sure, will be talking about this. So what was lost then by care? So what, you could say to that? Well, certainly social work as a service was effectively deleted. The need to talk to someone, to understand them, to develop a relationship was replaced by, as you yourself said, Bob, assessment of eligibility and construction of a care package. There was far less room for issues that perhaps challenge the neoliberal kind of language of perhaps of rights, of nuance, listening to someone's nuance, lived experience, being frail or having dementia, and also discrimination. Those issues don't sit comfortably with a kind of neoliberal agenda. And let's not forget, care management was never intended to think about or even conceptualise or have as part of its remit the challenging or the addressing of structural risks. Sorry to quote myself here, that in dislocating the older person from their life course and social context, care management fails to define and in any way meet or address those needs with social, economic or historical causes. For example, abuse, childhood abuse or domestic abuse or chronic poverty. That was never part of the care management mantra. And of course, it shifted away from original values of social work and its identity. The other point I want to make, I think, about care management was that I think there was a sort of systemic failure to recognise the nature of need, of older people's needs. Older people who came and still come to the doors of adult social care are people often with very complicated, comorbid, complex needs, dementia being often one of them. They have few resources. If they have resources, they're probably by their own care. They've often used up all the resources in their communities and their families. And they often have what I think is a term that's beginning to be used in the health literature, social frailty or social vulnerabilities, which is a mixture of things like poverty, poor housing, and others have alluded to this, self-neglect, isolation. So a clutch of issues that intersect with health to amplify the influence and the damage of both sets of issues. And then also Liz Lloyd's other phrase of necessarily dependent. So older people who often come to the attention of social services can't exit from care. They're not consumers of care in any normal sense of the word consumer. If you need help to go to the toilet, you need help to go to the toilet. You can't opt not to have that help. So I think that these are important things to recognise. And I think the care management ideology wasn't comfortable with some of those. Now moving on then to thinking about what we know about what older people themselves say that they value about social work. There isn't a huge amount on this, actually, and Jill and colleagues here have done more work than quite a lot of other people. So what's important? What we do know is that older people say that they actually value the social work process. And by that I mean the talking to, the building up a relationship, the listening, the understanding, the trying to appreciate the perspective of the older person. So the social work relationship, the social work process is as important to older people as the outcomes. Again, challenging perhaps the idea that outcomes are everything. Very much an emphasis on a relational approach and taking account of the life course. So taking account of what has gone before, you know, not just you are here in front of me with these needs, but how perhaps, where are the roots of some of those issues that concern you? Chronic poverty being one such example. And also listen to the carer. What's the carer's story, the carer's narrative? What is their experience? And there's some beginnings of us thinking about adopting a dyadic lens on assessment. Like how do we think about a couple who probably share the same space, have shared a long, long life together? I mean, shouldn't we sometimes be thinking about a dyadic assessment? And also a commitment to user self-determination agency and decision making, particularly for people who perhaps have communication problems or have issues like dementia, where it is very easy to marginalise, very easy to pay no attention, or to talk about capacity issues, which students, by the way, regularly do, which irritates me hugely. And the social work skills, Beresford's work suggests the social work skills of advocacy, of negotiation, of signposting, of practical guidance, and of psychotherapeutic support are very valued. And a quote from your work, Jill, from some time ago. So what's clear from the evidence is that it's not one thing, it's a mixture of skills, expertise, knowledge, and values. It's the bringing together of those things. What I think the nursing literature calls craft knowledge. I quite like that concept. So it's the bringing together of those things. So when people say, well, social work is or isn't effective, it's tempting to break it down into one of these elements. But actually what I'm hearing from older people and what research suggests is it is a combination of those skills. And by the way, I just want to underscore persistence there, because I think there's practically no room at the moment for you to be persistent. And I hear this from students and from social workers quite a lot. Okay, so let's move on to think about what's happening more recently. I'll talk for a little minute about strengths-based approaches. There are other models, and there are models that come under the umbrella of strengths-based approaches. I'm relatively confident I'm talking sense here because I'm part of the team, the Kales et al. Literature references, part of a team that's been looking at strengths-based approaches for the past 3 years. And what's striking about the work we've done is the enthusiasm that practitioners have for it. Really, really positive feedback about how much they value, well, having a model, having something to say, I am doing this in my work with adults. And the evidence from practitioners is that, this is reported by them, by the way, we haven't actually done work with service users, is that they report that strengths-based approaches improve outcomes for older people, for example, increased sense of hope, trust in adult social care, increased well-being, that the workers themselves talk about having greater autonomy, less bureaucracy, ability to be creative, more freedom, if you like, a little bit more like what we heard about at the beginning of my talk in relationship to the origins of care management, perhaps. And probably more cost effective and maybe preventing the use of long-term and more costly services. Of course, there are very robust criticisms of it. It isn't just the same old stuff repackaged. And certainly there were social workers that we interviewed so there's one well-known famous individual who became kind of our team's sort of mascot. I don't know her name, an individual social worker who said, it's a load of crap, all this. This is just good social work. Strengths-based approaches is good social work. It's what all of us have been trying to do for years. It's not new, it's the same stuff. We're just not allowed to call it this now. But Slasberg and Beresford and others would argue that without fundamental structural change to the status quo, improvements are limited. You're always going to be fiddling around the edges. I'll come back to that in a second. And then there's also some other criticism. One is that if you go on about strengths too much, you're at risk of ignoring the fact that people have actual needs. I mean, go back to the few slides earlier. The people that social workers are generally seeing need to get out of hospital and they need support to go home. Well, they may have lots of strengths and there's lots of strengths in their networks and the communities might have fantastic resources, but they need support from social care services. So I think that's a risk. And then Tanya Moore talks about authentic relational impact. She argues that strengths-based approaches, along with lots of social work historically, that without authentic relational engagement between the social worker and the older person, you're defending against your own sense of dependency. You're looking at your future self and you're not liking what you see. She makes quite a strong argument about the fact that social workers need to engage at a much deeper level. Okay, now, Lynn Romeo mentioned this exciting work, Social with Older People project. I can't call them findings, I can only call them key things because they're not in the public domain as yet, but they are about to be in the public domain. And Jerry Noel-Skerrin, Denise Tower, Paul Willis and others are involved in this project. I'm not going to read them out, but you can see they resonate with some of the things I've been talking about, actually, in terms of what matters to older people and what's important. So they interview social workers, older people, carers and health professionals. So they've got a rich, and they observe social workers at work, so they've got a rich database. I was going to draw something up, I can't remember what it was now. Oh, his persistence is there again, by the way. Jeff. I haven't mentioned the law much, but the law, one of the things that quite a lot of health professionals said about having social workers in their team was how significant it was for social workers to be able to bring the law to bear, rights and the law to bear, on discussions about older people. So that's the funding. So it's funded from the School for Social Care Research, and those are the people involved, and they've got an X account and go online and so on. So by all means, follow and find out more. Right, galloping to the end, David. So what's what I've called legacies, really. I think that we still are. Well, we still have we gone back and come forward again? I'm not sure. It feels like a lot of the themes that defined the community care era in terms of tighter eligibility, lower levels of funding, caps on fees, all that sort of stuff. That's alive and well, isn't it? And worse, probably, actually. But it set in train these kind of parallel lines that still are there today that very much characterise the social care and social work worlds. And of course, welfare austerity, and I use that term loosely, has massively narrowed and constrained what is possible to do in publicly funded social care. And the language, of course, has inevitably aligned itself with that. And I feel quite strongly that we are possibly exploiting, but at the very least, we're expecting more and more and more of family carers. If you shrink the welfare state, there are more older people out there with complex needs. Who does the caring? Yep, family carers. And imagine, that a lot of those are older people themselves looking after frail partners, or, an elderly parent looking after a very late middle-aged or even older son or daughter with learning disabilities. So we're expecting more and more of those people, not just more hours, but more complex tasks. And I said I would come back to Salzburg and Beresford. They say the pressures to assess at the expense of relationships will remain all the time. Resource precedes need. So that, I think, is an overarching criticism of the system. Safeguarding appears to have become this quite separate activity from the wider social work role. I don't know what I think about that. Be interested in Bridget's reflections. And of course, we still have very few social workers work with. We don't know actually how many social workers work with older people. We know how many social workers work with adults. I think it's about 15,500 in England. And that's gone down, it's gradually been going down. Yes, there are more people probably working around them in the roles I've just described. And I always say to the students, beware the role with a long title like review and assessment officer, because that would have been a social worker, but 10 years ago. Social work is still reserved. I mean, in most teams, I've done work on this, it's for the very complex cases, the most challenging cases, the ones with high levels of emotion, the ones where there might be a legal issue, where there might be a challenge to the local authority, where there's complaints. So it's that sort of case that social workers still work with. And of course, a whole load of social work roles, including things like carers assessments, are outsourced to third sector organisations now. So I think, ironically, there's also an inverse relationship between what is needed and the investment in social work with older people and their families. We have more older people with more complex needs, both the social frailty and the healthcare issues living in the community with older family carers. And we also have increasing levels of inequality in our older population, including our older. And these are particularly pronounced issues for older women, people from minority communities and people living in deprived areas. But it's not just the concrete stuff, it's the fact that we have more older people facing situations characterised by uncertainty, fear, poverty, transition, complexity, change, loss, and I've mentioned social vulnerability and risk. And I would argue that that is squarely the terrain and skill set of social workers. For the camera. I'm going to advertise my book. It's just been published with Mary Larkin.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, and all those reflections. And just thinking at the end there, coming back to NISWA research, what is it that social workers are actually doing, working with that complexity and all of those issues in a way it hasn't changed, but the pressures are there and significant. So, just setting up the next. Can I just? No, don't. You're going to do it. Okay. Well, can I introduce Bridget, who I first worked with in a way back in the 1980s when I was at BASWA, and Bridget was very active then in the special interest group in ageing and so on. She's now Reader Emerita at the University of East Anglia, a member of the Dementia and Complexity in Later Life Research Group, has had a long career in practice and in academia, and has pioneered research on elder abuse and domestic violence, as you see through the literature, which is what you're going to talk about, Bridget. So thank you very much indeed, and welcome.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. I'm going to attempt the impossible because I've had an eye on the clock, and I have less than no time to whistle stop you through elder abuse, not least because I have to get a train at some point, not too long at the end of the session. I should have enough time, that should be fine. So, lots of things I thought I might try and cover were to do, or are to do with the emergence of this whole topic as an issue, what I've grandly called the road to recognition, although I think we're sort of sometimes stuck in the middle of that. Issues about terminology, some stuff around policy and how policy developed in this area, some practice implications, and I don't expect I'll get there, but there's a final slide which people might see and reflect on later on, human rights and older people and where we might be going with that. So, in general, very broad terms, this is not a new issue. It's something which has been going on for probably hundreds of years. One of the things that I'm very fond of reminding students about is the Shakespeare play King Lear, which is about dysfunctional familial relationships and can be viewed from a certain lens to be abuse. It's a global phenomenon. We haven't found a country anywhere in the world where some form of abuse and neglect of older people or of adults who might have other forms of need around disability, complex health needs, mental health problems, where that doesn't exist. What we've seen in recent decades, and I guess I'm looking back here to the 1980s, 1990s onwards, is pretty recent recognition of the phenomenon as being a problem and yet increasing concern. And some of the reasons for that are around what I refer to as contextual matters. Demography, our aging population, the perception of the population as being a burden. We have references to silver tsunami, all those sorts of things. The fact that medical and technological advances through the course of the last century meant that actually far more people are living longer, and yet a number of those people, quite a lot of those people, will develop health needs in particular. and maybe have needs for care too. And we've seen this steady through a process of attention paid to advocacy and rights, and citizenship rights, human rights, systems of advocacy for people who aren't able to represent themselves, and definitional issues, which I may or may not come back to. So with all of that, we've got a comparative lack of recognition. It's an underdeveloped concept. And to an extent, it's still a taboo topic. It's hidden from public gaze. It happens behind closed doors very often. We don't know what's happening to individuals, either in their own homes or even, dare I say it, in institutional settings. There's been a tendency to look at this as being about the individual, the personal. But what I do want to flag up here is that institutional settings are very important in relation to all of this. And there was this original view around, this is a private issue here. We don't need to concern ourselves too much about this because it's happening in really largely in the context of people's own homes. And then it comes back to that discussion around child protection and around the home being the Englishman's castle. And what happens in the context of the home is somehow out of bounds, except there's been increasing public concern. Adult safeguarding, I'll come back to that a bit in relation to terminology. But we've also constructed this sort of welfare model around risk and vulnerability and protection, and people needing support and needing protection. And I think it's also fair to say that there's an importance, I think, around professional identification of lots of different issues. So I'm thinking here of the identification way back in the 60s around baby battering, largely by medical professionals, pediatricians, etc. Then we had in the 70s in this country attention paid to domestic violence, violence against younger adult women, intimate partner violence. But that didn't have the same professional attention. It was the women's movement, the feminist movement started drawing attention to this as a political with a small p, sometimes with a big P, issue. And then we come to the situation in relation to older people and to adults, and we come back, in a sense, to this professional identification, except this time it was identification by social workers more than health professionals, certainly initially. So, elder abuse was identified early in the US. That's not too surprising. They identified child safeguarding issues, they identified domestic violence much earlier than us. They're a much bigger sort of place. But it was known in social work in the 1960s. And even actually before that, there was some attention being paid to what was happening to individuals in care settings and around sort of social security. Having said that there was social work recognition, there was this early flurry of medical recognition in two journals, in the British Medical Journal and Modern Geriatrics, where doctors were writing about granny bashing or granny battering. Didn't write much and it wasn't picked up. There was this little flurry and then it sort of collapsed a bit. But age concern started paying attention from the early 1980s. There was a very early paper that was written by Christopher Cloak, who was then at the Tavistock, around what was known about this sort of topic. And then we got this sort of work which was beginning to filter through and to raise the profile within social work. Academic interest, however, has been established over time and much more slowly. Smallish group of people who were concerned about that. One of whom is sitting delightfully opposite me, my colleague Jill Manthorpe. Early social work publications, the earliest really dedication here to Mervyn Eastman and his work as Director of Social Services, commissioned by Age Concern to write this little tiny book with a very graphic cover. You probably can't see it too well, but it's a broken picture. It's a photograph of an older woman and the glass is broken. And Mervyn collected testimonies largely from caregivers about the situations that they experienced. Little plug here, Jeremy Dixon at Bath is having a seminar, a webinar later in the month, and it's partly to launch his book, but he's also going to be looking at adult safeguarding, and Mervyn will be speaking at that, and we'll be talking about his publication. The one in the middle is a paper by me. It was the very first thing, actually the second thing that I had published. I had something published on social work and, well, older people and abuse and social work and stuff in a little known journal called Elders in 1992. And I then took that and developed it much further and wrote in BJSW. My very first full academic publication, I started at the top. Someone said to me, because I was at UEA, where are you going to place this paper? And I said, I'm going to try BJSW first because people know about that. And when they reject me, I'll work my way through that list. Took a while, some revisions, etc. It came out. The next book publication is a book by Jackie Pritchard, in some ways quite similar to me. She had a practice background. She'd been a manager. She was a team leader of hospital social work. I was too. She didn't step into the academic world, and she's now a hypnotherapist. So she's not in social work as much. But she wrote this book, which you might see says 1994. There's some dispute even online. It doesn't appear in Jackie's catalogue of past books. It's disappeared from Jessica Kingsley publications. And I've seen it referred to online as both 1992 and 1994, although I think 94 might be a second edition. This book is called The Abuse of Elderly People, a handbook for professionals. And one of my sons picked it up one day and said, is that a how to do it guide? Just to make me laugh because I'd had a difficult day. Moving on to policy, there was some early work within the Social Services Inspectorate. People might be interested to know that there was a thing, guidance with a snazzy title, No Longer Afraid, the Safeguard of Older People in Domestic Settings. It was very clear this was not about institutions. And of course, the backdrop to that was at that time, most institutional care, residential care of older people was run by social services, local authorities. So they didn't want to draw attention to that because they might have had to do something about it. A little bit later, but around the same time, there was also some work going on commissioned by the Social Services Inspectorate, but it was about sexual abuse of adults with learning disabilities. And colleagues from Kent in the Tizard Centre were quite heavily involved in that. But what you can pick up is this sort of theme, no longer afraid, it could never happen here, there are no easy answers, and we come right down to no secrets. These snazzy titles which don't really mean a lot, but they're there and they're enshrined. I came across practitioners who thought the safeguard of older people in domestic settings was about home safety. They didn't know what safeguard meant. And to be honest, they weren't hugely interested. But we worked through that by degrees. Virginia Bottomley, Junior Minister for Health, who was qualified and had worked for quite a long time as a social worker, made a very ambitious statement in a Newsnight programme. The topic being discussed was child sexual abuse and abuse of children in institutions, and she was, I guess, sort of sidelined in a way by a question about abuse of older people, which had been fed in from somebody at the side. And her statement is just a classic. I don't frankly think that abuse of the elderly is a major issue, thank goodness, in our society. What she didn't know was that in her own social services inspectorate at that time, there was quite a lot of developing concern. One of their people had been on a field trip for several months to the States to see what was happening, and work was taking place on producing this guidance. The following year, it also in a Newsnight programme, because at that time, journalists, presenters asked difficult questions. He was also asked another question about elder abuse. And Tim Yeo, who was by then Junior Minister of Health, because Virginia Bottomley had stepped up to being Minister of Health, he said, well, there might be some abuse that arose because of carer stress. By the following year, the then Junior Minister of Health, John Bowis, who was a doctor, wrote the foreword to the guidelines. And later that year, he launched the organisation Action on Elder Abuse, which Jill and I were both involved with at that early point. But there was general dissatisfaction about this. The DOH set up a working group, which was originally convened in 1997. It had some academics on it. It also had quite a lot of NGOs. I know Action on Elder Abuse were there, and the Ancroft Trust and various people. And there was this decision that was eventually taken to look at protection of vulnerable adults, what was called adult protection. It was unbelievably lengthy, a very slow process and progress, partly because they couldn't agree on a definition. And that's partly why the definition in No Secrets is very confused and broad, because nobody could agree. The different parties just disagreed every time they met. But they did agree eventually to have this, sort of 2 years later, they came up with this consultation period on guidance and guidelines. So the consultation process was in 1999. Guidance came out in 2000, and I'm way behind time, of course. But that told local authorities what they should be doing. There was a consultation process started in 2008. Again, lots of disagreement about issues, and it still about. One of the things they talked about at length, which Jill knows well about, is powers of entry. And Jill could tell a wonderful tale about the consultation responses, whereby I think it was acknowledged that most of the responses were saying we need to have powers of entry, and the Department of Health massaged their figures, and well, they didn't really have figures, they just said we don't need this sort of thing. They picked out the very nice quotes about nanny state and not needing this and all of those sorts of things and used it to their advantage, and we still don't have powers of entry. But we didn't get that revised guidance, and it sort of trolled along and came out. It was included in the Care Act. Part 7 is the key chunk of the Care Act, which covers adult safeguarding, and we also, Chapter 14 of the Care and Support Statutory Guidance, which originally came out in 2016 and is regularly updated, is the thing around safeguarding. But it's framework legislation. It says there should be safeguarding adult boards. It says that self-neglect should be included. It doesn't really go into all the sort of nitty-gritty that people might need to know. And it also introduced other areas like honour-based violence and modern slavery and trafficking into this whole area as things we should be dealing with. Meanwhile, Scotland had got on quietly, or not so quietly, with the Adult Support and Protection Scotland Act, which does include powers of entry. That's been researched, and it isn't used as widely as people feared it might be. The Scottish people, the Scottish government would say that was always our intention, it's a last resort. But the argument from England has been, just because Scotland have got powers of entry, we certainly don't need to go down that route. And I think might still continue to be the elements of that. But Wales, at the same time as our Care Act, came out with the Social Services and Wellbeing Act with a focus on safeguarding as well. Although both of those countries talked about adult protection for quite a long time. And Wales have powers of entry, but unlike Scotland, they don't have powers of removal. And there's a distinction, and quite a lot of discussion and debate in Wales, I understand, about why have a power of entry if you then can't take action if you really need to. If you really determine somebody might need to be taken out of a situation, even if briefly, and you can't do that, what's the point of going in? Open question. We also had regulatory changes from the mid-1980s, and I've just put up a few, but these are in relation to institutions, and the focus has really been on sort of regulations and controlling the workforce and all of those sorts of things. Although, of course, we do have the care home regulations and go way back to the Registered Homes Act, which looks at issues in relation to fitness of managers, etc. What's in the name? We've been through a load. Granny battering, granny bashing, old age abuse, abuse of older people, elder abuse. The states played around with inadequate care for quite a while and then decided it wasn't quite right. The World Health Organization talk both about elder mistreatment and elder maltreatment. Jill and I were involved in a report, and there was quite a bit of discussion with the European Office for their report, it was, saying, maltreatment, what's that? But they've done a report on child maltreatment, so there we are. We're back to talking about abuse of older people in a lot of places. World Health Organization have just said, well, maybe it would be better. There's some concern about discrimination, etc. So you're not going to go there. But here we talk about adult safeguarding or safeguarding adults at risk. It might be at risk of harm, or it might be at risk of abuse, but it's adults at risk. Implications for practice. This is everybody's business, not just a social work issue. There's a clear need for partnership and collaboration, acknowledged from early on. Working with individuals has sometimes taken second place, but I think is now more firmly sort of at the top in terms of working with individuals to assist them, to support them with what they need to do and how to keep themselves safe. But there's multi-agency working and working in partnership. Jill and I undertook at the very first Department of Health funded project on partnerships and protection in adult partnerships and regulation in adult protection, which was a big mouthful. Making safeguarding personal has come out of the Care Act and is very much about the centrality of older people. But we still have, as Alisoun has reminded us about, this sort of technical stuff around processes and policies and procedures and structures, and a focus on what happens when things go wrong. So there's still a very clear need all this time later to develop good practice and develop interventions. And I'm putting that slide up and not talking to it.
Watching your train, I'm sorry.
It's fine. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, apologies for the chairing that has put some pressure on there, but illustrating it's so much easier for people to talk about policies and procedures, but actually what you do and how you build relationships and how you what you do when you've got in the door, if you like, is the area where we need development, and that's where social workers have skills which people find difficult to comment on. We started a bit late, so we have a few minutes. If anybody has to go, people are already going. So first of all, I should thank our speakers and for all that you have given to us over such a stimulating afternoon, obviously too short. Hopefully we'll get articles for the bulletin that will be written up, and Sarah is writing for professional social work, and the slides will be available as well, and we hope the recording will be available on the King's YouTube. That takes a bit of time to get together, So our really sincere thanks to our speakers. We can say that because one of them is leaving, and we can perhaps have some time for questions. So is anybody wanting, or comments? Anybody want to come back? Brian?
Well, I mean, the speaker's been brilliant and stimulating, and this is going to be an afterthought you're going to regret hearing. I've got 3 positives that I just wanted to touch on, but I begin with a fairly pessimistic, cynical perspective on this world and the long time in it. And I haven't just been a director of social services for quite a long period, but since 2010, I spent 10 years till last year as an independent chair of 3 safeguarding adults boards in London boroughs. But let me just extract 3 different positives over the period. The first is the last, which came from what Alisoun said. I think that if strengths-based practice, that I've never understood what it means just good social work. That is a real achievement. What is important is that what those social workers, whatever they perhaps been called instead in some places, are doing needs to be clearly and concisely described so that it will get across what is actually happening rather than get lost in the language. So I don't think we should worry too much if it's only that, providing people understand what it is. And if we go back to 2 periods of past time, I went to be a director in the local authority that pioneered this case management and then found themselves with completely out of control budgets, and that's when I came in. But out of that came a real drive, and it happened elsewhere, of course, as well, around self-directed support and personal assessment, personal assistance, and ultimately independent support networks of service users with each other, and a challenge to the local authority. And we had direct payments. I know that's been abused since, but some really good things that did focus on self-directed approaches to care that came out of that. And some of that's endured and some of it's been distorted as it's gone forward, I know. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on was the positives that I think have come out of safeguarding. At its best, I've seen, and it's a combination of safeguarding adults' requirements and some of the chairs, I think, who've got a social work and other backgrounds that have brought a professional user experience focus to it. And combined also with the advent of local authorities that have actively had good principal social workers who've been a challenge within the departments and have actually focused on good social work around issues of abuse, because a lot of social work in local authority departments needs to become either rationing care management or mental capacity and risk and deprivation of liberties. But around even the latter has become a focus on capacity that people have and should not be denied, and the ways in which unwise decisions are perfectly legitimate for people to make with or without. And I think there's been some good social work that has protected some of the core elements that we would all value amidst some of this bureaucratic control that's been dropped on us. I hope some sense in it.
Some interesting points.
Yes, I chaired a safeguarding board for a period. It didn't have the same focus in the authority I was in, but it was it did bring forward some of the things that Brian was talking about. Bob, were you wanting to?
I don't know what I'm talking about here, but I have a dystopian observation to make.
This is Bob Hudson.
Having watched our Prime Minister fixated with Elon Musk and how AI will take away so many of our jobs, and hearing you all talk about the shift from real social work to the way care management has often evolved, assessments, tick box assessments, it's already the case that AI algorithms determine the first attempt to look at UK citizenship applications and certain welfare benefits. And is it too dystopian to think that before too long, they'll do it for social care assessments too?
And I don't think that's possible, for the reasons I ended up saying. But I think if the growth of the people that I described in my last slide, and we know there are growing numbers of people with complex needs, carers, who've got all sorts of issues, facing all sorts. I just genuinely don't think AI is going to be able to touch
Doesn't
that.
mean they won't do it.
Yeah, but then they'll do it with everything. I suppose I think it's where you do need to have a human relationship. That's the only way forward for supporting people in those complex situations. I personally don't worry. I worry about it in lots of other fields, I have to say. But if anything, I think it's potentially social work may survive.
It throws up a really interesting, challenging question. It's astonishing what AI can do. I've seen notes of meetings that have been written by AI. I wouldn't have known that they weren't written by somebody who's been there sort of reflecting on it. But it's a chilling sort of thought. Anybody else want to comment? I know time is a pressure. Well, I think I'm sorry that we were a bit rushed at the end. We started a bit late, so actually we're not so far over time. But thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for those who've come. Thank you to those who battled online. I'm just double checking there aren't any hands up. It's been a really interesting webinar and seminar. We haven't had enough discussion. Perhaps the scope for finding other ways of taking that forward. Just to finish, I suppose it is deeply emotional for thousands and thousands of families. I was with my aunt who died at Christmas. I was with her in Canada in September. I had to tell her every 15 minutes who I was. And that experience, she was in her 90s, but she was supported at home by a fantastic sort of set of carers that she was paying for and people. And she died in her own home with all of those issues. And living through that experience, watching her sort of decline, but how it was managed. There are so many people who are living that, and people are carrying that tension into their personal lives. People of my generation and the number of people, it is astonishing that there isn't more attention given to it politically and socially, and we need to get angry about that, and I think we should. So thank you for firing us up with some knowledge and understanding, and thank you, Brian, also for saying that there are positive things that people can do, and that's also what we need to hold on to, and social workers carry the flag for that. So thank you very much. And at that rhetorical note, have a safe journey home. And if anybody wants to leave some money, thank you very much.
Thank you. Did you have to rush off?